The dust of the high plain settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that clung to hope and choked it silent. It coated the worn boards of the Redemption train station, the cracked leather of Arthur's boots, and the creased foreclosure notice he held balled in his fist. The paper was a death sentence for a life's work, a formal declaration that the land his father had bled for would soon belong to the bank. He watched the last train of the day hiss and groan, pulling away from the platform like a black iron snake slithering back into its hole, leaving behind only emptiness and the oppressive heat of the late afternoon. He was waiting for nothing, and nothing had arrived. His last desperate gamble, a mail-order bride whose passage he could barely afford, had not been on that train. He was alone, with the notice in his hand feeling heavier than a tombstone. Then he saw her. She sat on a solitary bench at the far end of the platform, a statue of stillness amidst the swirling dust. She was a large woman, built with a sturdiness that seemed to defy the brittle landscape around her. Her luggage, two well-kept trunks, sat at her feet. She had been on that train, he realized. He watched as the stationmaster, a man whose face was a roadmap of other people's sorrows, approached her. Their words were lost to the wind, but the man's apologetic shrug and the woman's slow, deliberate nod told the whole story. Another man, the one she was meant to meet, had taken one look and fled. Arthur felt a strange kinship with her abandonment. The world had cast them both aside on the same desolate afternoon. He straightened his shoulders, the motion stiff with exhaustion and a flickering ember of resolve. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the hollow planks. She watched his approach, her expression unreadable, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She did not look frightened or pitiful, she looked like someone assessing a tool to see if it was still useful. He stopped a few feet from her, pulling the crumpled notice from his pocket and smoothing it out. He began, his voice rough from disuse. "My name is Arthur. My ranch is failing. The bank will take it in 2 months. I have 300 acres of dry soil, a weakening well, and a roof that leaks." He paused, holding her gaze. "I was supposed to meet a bride today. I see you were, too. My offer is this, a legal name, half of whatever is left, and a partner's share in the work. It is a poor offer, but it is an honest 1 inch. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, appraised him without sentiment. She did not ask why his intended had not arrived, nor did she offer any explanation for her own circumstances. Her focus was entirely on the transaction he proposed. "Do you have a mortgage?" she asked, her voice lower and steadier than he expected. It was a voice that did not waste words. "Yes. With the bank in town." Mr. Thorne, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed her face, but it was gone before he could name it. "Are you a drinking man, Mr. Arthur?" "No, No time for it, and less money. Are you a violent man?" "I've never raised a hand to another soul, save for a man who tried to cheat me at cards once." "I'm not proud of it." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acceptance. "My name is Beatrice. My father was a farmer in the East. He taught me letters and numbers. I have a dowry." She gestured to one of the trunks. "Not enough to buy passage back, but enough for seed and supplies. I will not be a burden. I expect the same of you." She stood, her height nearly matching his own. She was not just large, she was powerful, her presence a solid and undeniable fact. "This partnership you offer, is it just for the work, or does it include the vows?" He met her gaze, the truth of his desperation laid bare. "The bank looks more kindly on a family man. It might buy us time. The vows would be part of it. Then we have an agreement," she said, as if they had just settled on the price of flour. She extended a hand, not for him to kiss, but to shake. Her grip was firm, her skin calloused. It was the hand of a woman who knew labor. The journey to his ranch was made in near silence, the rattling of his old wagon the only consistent sound. The landscape grew harsher, the earth cracking under the relentless sun. He pointed out landmarks with a grim sense of duty, the dried creek bed, the rocky outcrop where his father had broken an axle, the distant silhouette of Thorne's sprawling property, a dark crown on the horizon. He expected her to show signs of regret or fear, but Beatrice simply watched, her eyes taking in every detail with an unnerving placidity. She was not seeing a wasteland, she was seeing a problem to be solved, a set of conditions to be understood and managed. The first sight of the ranch was a test of that resolve. It was more than dilapidated, it was a study in decay. The cabin sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, its porch held up by a prayer. The fences were skeletal, broken teeth in a grimacing jawline. The barn leaned at an angle that defied physics, its roof a patchwork of rust and sky. Arthur pulled the wagon to a halt, the silence heavy with the things he had not said, the full measure of his failure now on display. He could not bring himself to look at her, bracing for the accusation, the quiet disappointment that would be worse than any angry outburst. But Beatrice simply climbed down from the wagon, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She walked to the well and peered into its depths. She ran a hand along the brittle wood of a fence post. She walked the perimeter of the sad little vegetable patch, its plants withered and brown. She was not seeing ruin, she was conducting an inventory. When she returned to the wagon, her face was set with a practicality that bordered on serene. The well is low, but not dry. The soil here is better than out on the plains. It needs feeding. The cabin's foundation looks sound enough. The leaks can be patched. She turned her gaze to him, and for the first time, he felt he was not being judged, but measured. You did not lie, Mr. Arthur. The work is considerable. She began unlashing her trunks, her meaning clear. She was staying. That night, they ate a sparse meal of beans and stale bread. She had found a small sack of flour and, with a practiced efficiency that amazed him, produced a stack of flatbread cooked over the small stove. They partitioned the cabin single room with a blanket hung over a rope. It was a flimsy barrier, but the line it drew was absolute. He lay on his cot, listening to the sound of her quiet breathing on the other side, and for the first time in months, the crushing weight of his solitude felt a little bit lighter. He was no longer just a man waiting for the end. He was a partner in a desperate enterprise. The next morning, Beatrice rose before the sun, moving with a quiet purpose that filled the small cabin. When Arthur emerged, he found she had already mended the broken handle on the water pump and was methodically sharpening the blade of a rusty hoe. She did not work with frantic energy, but with a steady, relentless rhythm, each movement calculated for maximum effect. She opened her second trunk, and he saw it was not filled with clothes and fripperies, but with tools of survival. Tins of seeds, neatly labeled. Spools of thread, needles, and patches. And at the very bottom, a heavy, leather-bound ledger and several bottles of ink. My father believed a farm's most important crop was its accounts, she said, noticing his stare. He said numbers don't lie, even when the sky does. She handed him a list written in a clear, precise hand. These are the supplies we need. Your credit may be poor at the general store, but my dowry is cash. He took the list, stunned. It was practical, sensible, and completely devoid of personal wants. Seed potatoes, sacks of feed, nails, tar for the roof. She was investing in the ranch, in their partnership. That day, they began the slow, arduous work of resurrection. While he rode into town, his posture a little straighter with her cash in his pocket, she cleared the dead plants from the garden, turning the soil with a strength that made his back ache just to watch. She found a small, steady trickle of water from a rock formation 100 yards behind the cabin, a seep he had dismissed as useless, and began digging a narrow channel to divert it toward her new garden plot. By the time he returned, she had already created something from nothing. Hope, in the form of dark, damp earth, ready for planting. Days bled into weeks. A routine formed, dictated by the sun and the seemingly endless list of tasks. He repaired the fences while she patched the roof. He cleared stubborn rocks from a field he'd long given up on, and she planted the garden that was now, against all odds, sprouting green shoots. Her greatest contribution, however, took place by lamplight. Every evening, she would sit at the small table with the rancher's books spread before her. He would watch her, the tip of her pen scratching across the pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. He had always hated the numbers, the columns of debt that only ever grew larger. To him, they were a language of failure. But Beatrice spoke it fluently. One night, she looked up, her expression grim. "These loan documents from Mr. Thorne," she said, her finger tapping a column of figures. "The interest rate is not fixed. It changes. And these fees, a land surveil fee and an account maintenance charge, they appear every few months. Did you agree to these?" He shook his head. "I can read, but the fine print." "Thorne just said it was standard." "It is not standard," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It is theft." The arrival of Mr. Thorne's carriage was an unwelcome spectacle. It was black and polished, drawn by two magnificent horses that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the struggling ranch. Mr. Thorne himself stepped down, a man whose tailored suit and silver-tipped cane were an insult to the dusty ground. His smile was winter cold as he surveyed the modest improvements, the mended fence, the patch of green that was Beatrice's garden, the new tar on the cabin roof. His eyes did not see progress, they saw an asset appreciating in value, an asset he intended to own. "Arthur, my boy," he said, his tone dripping with false familiarity. "I see you've been busy. And you've found yourself some help." His gaze slid over Beatrice, who stood on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. There was a dismissive cruelty in his assessment of her size, a smirk that he didn't bother to hide. "A woman of substance, I see. Good for the winter nights." Arthur felt a hot surge of anger, but before he could speak, Beatrice stepped forward. She did not flinch or look away. She met Thorne's gaze with a calm, level stare that seemed to unnerve him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice even. "My husband and I were just reviewing your loan statements. We have some questions about the interest calculations." Thorne's smile tightened. The word husband had caught him off guard. "Business details, my dear. Surely you don't trouble your pretty head with such things." "I trouble my head with any number that doesn't add up," Beatrice replied, her tone unwavering. "And many of your numbers do not add up." The banker's condescending facade began to crack. He had come expecting to find a broken man he could easily intimidate. He had not anticipated a partner, let alone one who could read a ledger. He turned his attention back to Arthur, his voice losing its artificial warmth. "The payment is due at the end of the month, Arthur. No extensions. The land is worth more than your debt now. I'd be doing you a favor by taking it off your hands." It was an undisguised threat. He tipped his hat with mocking politeness toward Beatrice and returned to his carriage, leaving a cloud of dust and menace in his wake. Arthur watched him go, the familiar dread settling back into his bones. But this time, it was different. He was not alone. He looked at Beatrice, who was still watching the departing carriage, her expression one of cold, hard calculation. "He is not just a banker," she said softly. "He is a predator." Thorne's visit acted like a bellows on the small flame of their partnership, turning it into a focused, roaring fire. The unspoken threat lent a new urgency to their labor. They worked from the first hint of dawn until long after the sun had set, a synchronized team fueled by a shared enemy. The physical space between them began to shrink, their movements overlapping in the tight confines of the cabin and the demanding expanse of the fields. They spoke little, but a new language formed in shared glances, in the simple act of passing a tool or a cup of water. One afternoon, a sudden, violent storm rolled in, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent. A young calf, one of the few they had left, became trapped in the thick, sucking mud at the water's edge. Its terrified cries were nearly lost in the wind and rain. Without a word, they ran. The mud was a treacherous mire, pulling at their boots, trying to claim them too. Arthur looped a rope around the calf's belly while Beatrice dug frantically at the mud with her bare hands, trying to free its legs. It was a brutal, exhausting struggle. The rain plastered their hair to their faces, and the mud coated them from head to foot. At last, with a final, coordinated heave that strained every muscle in their bodies, the calf came free. They dragged it to solid ground, where it stumbled away to its mother. They stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, soaked and filthy, the storm beginning to recede. Arthur looked at Beatrice. A smear of mud was on her cheek, and her hair had come loose from its bun, but in her eyes, he saw an unbreakable strength that humbled him. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently wiped the mud from her face. His touch lingered. She did not pull away. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of rain and wet earth, the terms of their agreement were rewritten. The blanket hanging in the cabin was still a partition of wood and wool, but the wall between their hearts had dissolved. The ledgers became Beatrice's nightly obsession. While Arthur cleaned and oiled their tools, she would sit by the lantern, her face illuminated by its soft glow, her pen scratching methodically across the paper. She was no longer just checking the bank's figures, she was hunting. She gathered copies of other local ranchers' loan agreements from the general store, ostensibly to compare terms, but her true purpose was more strategic. She pieced together a pattern, a quiet narrative of financial ruin that all pointed back to one man. Thorne was not just an opportunist, he was an architect of failure. He issued loans with intentionally confusing terms, targeting farmers who were hardworking but uneducated in the ways of finance. He would let them fall behind, then heap on fraudulent fees, ensuring their debt spiraled out of control until foreclosure became inevitable. His goal wasn't the loan payments, it was the land and, more importantly, the water rights that came with it. Arthur's ranch, with its modest but steady well, was a key piece of the puzzle. One evening, she finally found the smoking gun. Cross-referencing Arthur's payment receipts with Thorne's official statements, she discovered a series of clear forgeries. Payments Arthur had made had been recorded as smaller amounts, or not at all, creating artificial defaults that triggered penalty fees. "He hasn't just been overcharging us," she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "He has been stealing from us." From everyone she pushed the ledgers across the table. Her finger traced the damning evidence, the elegant loop of Thorne's signature on a doctored receipt, the clear discrepancy between the payment made and the payment recorded. It was undeniable proof of a systematic crime. Arthur stared at the papers, the ink on the page representing years of his own sweat and fear. He felt a rage so pure it was like ice in his veins. But beside the rage, something else bloomed, a fierce, soaring pride in the woman sitting across from him. She had given him more than a chance, she had given him a weapon. They now had a choice. They could use this knowledge to simply save themselves, to negotiate a private settlement. Or they could risk everything to expose Thorne for what he was. They looked at each other across the table, the lamplight casting long shadows. Their decision was made without a single word being spoken. The next morning, they rode into town not in their dusty work clothes, but in their Sunday best. Beatrice wore a simple dark dress she had altered to fit, its starkness lending her a formidable dignity. Arthur wore a suit he hadn't touched since his father's funeral. They were no longer supplicants begging for an extension, they were litigants coming to present their case. They walked into the Thorne Banking and Loan, the polished brass and dark mahogany designed to make a person feel small and insignificant. Heads turned. Their presence together, so purposeful and resolute, was an unusual sight. Mr. Thorne was in his office, a glass-walled cage from which he observed his domain. He saw them enter and a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He gestured for them to come in, his expression one of a man granting a tiresome audience. "Arthur," he said, not bothering to rise. "If this is about another extension, the answer is still no." Arthur did not reply. He stood by the door, a silent guard, while Beatrice approached the grand desk. She did not sit in the chair offered. Instead, she placed her ledger on the polished surface, opening it to a marked page. "We are not here to ask for an extension, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the quiet office. "We are here to discuss your fraudulent accounting practices." Thorne laughed, a short, ugly bark. "That's a serious accusation." "You'd better have proof." "I do," Beatrice said calmly. She laid out Arthur's payment receipts next to the bank's official statements. She used a pen to point to the discrepancies, one by one. Her explanation was methodical, precise, and irrefutable. She spoke of forged entries, of illegal penalty fees, of a calculated scheme to defraud not just Arthur, but half the ranchers in the county. As she spoke, Thorne's condescending smirk dissolved, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped fury. The mask of civility was gone, revealing the predator beneath. He rose from his chair, his eyes fixed on Arthur. "You'd best get your woman under control," he snarled. These are dangerous lies, but Arthur did not waver. He met the banker's gaze, his own quiet strength a mirror of his wife's. "She is my wife," he said, his voice low and steady. "And they are not lies. The numbers are here. And they will be seen." Their confrontation had not gone unnoticed. Jacob, a neighboring rancher whose own property was teetering on the edge of foreclosure, had been waiting to see the banker. He had heard Beatrice's clear, damning words through the glass wall of the office. He saw the proof laid out on the desk and the cornered look in Thorne's eyes. A seed of doubt, long suppressed by fear and shame, finally took root. He backed away from the office door and walked out of the bank, his face a storm of anger and realization. He did not go home. He went to the general store, then to the saloon, and then to the blacksmith's forge. The story spread through the small town like a grass fire, a whispered rumor that quickly grew into a roar of collective outrage. People who had felt isolated in their financial struggles suddenly saw they were not alone, they were all victims of the same man. Within the hour, a small crowd had gathered outside the bank's windows, their faces grim. Thorne, trapped in his office, saw the tide turning against him. He was no longer dealing with one desperate farmer and his oversized wife, he was facing a populist rebellion. The threat of a bank run, of a full-scale legal investigation that would scrutinize every ledger he owned, was now terrifyingly real. His bluster evaporated, replaced by the cold sweat of self-preservation. He looked at Beatrice, his expression a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "What do you want?" he rasped. "We want our loan corrected," she said, her voice devoid of triumph. "The fraudulent fees removed, the interest recalculated at a fair rate, and the term extended. The same offer must be made to every other family you have defrauded." Thorne stared at her, his empire crumbling. He had no choice. With a trembling hand, he drew up a new agreement for Arthur, his pen strokes angry and sharp. They had won. It was not a complete victory, the man was not ruined, not in jail, but they had saved the ranch. They had saved their home. The ride back was quiet, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. When they reached the ranch, Arthur helped Beatrice down from the wagon. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the calluses on her palm. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, for the first time, he untied the rope and took down the blanket that had divided their room. A year made all the difference. The ranch was no longer a skeleton, it was alive, breathing with the rhythms of life and hard work. The cabin had a new, solid porch. The fields, properly irrigated and tended, yielded a bounty that was more than enough for them. The barn stood straight and true, filled with hay and the sounds of healthy livestock. Their partnership, forged in desperation, had been tempered by adversity and annealed by love. It was a union of profound respect, a quiet understanding that ran deeper than words. Beatrice had discovered she had a talent not just for numbers, but for commerce. She now ran a small but thriving stall at the town market twice a week, selling their surplus vegetables, fresh eggs, and her surprisingly popular preserves. She dealt with customers with the same calm competence she applied to everything, her presence a fixture of reliability and honesty. Arthur, free from the crushing weight of manufactured debt, had become the man he was always meant to be. The stoic anxiety had been replaced by a quiet confidence, the worry lines around his eyes softened by the hint of a smile. One afternoon, as Beatrice was packing up her stall, the train pulled into the station across the square. She watched as the passengers disembarked. Her eyes were drawn to a young woman, left alone on the platform, her single suitcase beside her. The woman was thin and pale, her shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. The stationmaster was speaking to her, his gestures gentle and apologetic. Beatrice knew that look. She had worn it herself. It was the look of someone who had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. She finished packing her wagon, then walked across the dusty square. The young woman looked up as she approached, her eyes wide with apprehension. Beatrice stopped before her, offering not pity, but possibility. "The work is hard, and the days are long," she said, her voice steady and kind. "But the roof is sound, and the food is plentiful." We could use another pair of hands at our ranch, if you are interested. A flicker of hope ignited in the young woman's eyes, fragile but bright. The cycle had come full circle. The abandoned had become the rescuer, paying forward the same simple, honest offer that had once saved her.